Hey, we made it to the end of the course and congratulations, you are a completer. So good job for finishing out this course. There's a lot of people that don't finish what they start. So good on you for that. Let's do a quick review over some of the content that we covered within this course. We kicked this course off by getting into wide area networks or WANs. We talked about interconnecting our different sites with these WAN technologies and how these WAN connections look very different than our local area networks. And then we took those concepts and applied it to configuring our WAN links with things like HDLC and point-to-point protocols. So we applied HDLC and point-to-point protocols to our different links here so that we could have communication going between these different devices. And so those devices have different addresses, and the headers of the frames look different as well. And even though we had connectivity from device to device, we didn't yet have connectivity across our network. So we had to start learning about routing and what routing gives us, what routers are and the functions that they carry out. We talked about routes, we got into a routing table, and some of the specifics about what those routes look like and how to identify certain components within a route and that routing table. And of course, those routers need to learn of those routes, so we talked about different ways that a router could learn of different routes within the network and how it chooses the best route if it has multiple routes to the same network, and how the router can speed up the process and utilize less resources, but with things like Cisco Express Forwarding. Then we took those concepts and we started looking at static routes. Not only did we take a look at static routes, but we also configured it across our network so we could get some communication going across our network. But that would be a lot to manage on larger networks. So that's where we use something like a dynamic routing protocol, which transfers that information back and forth between our routers. And there are a lot of different types of routing protocols, like interior gateway protocols, exterior gateway protocols, distance vector, link state, path vector. So we talked about the pros and cons of each one of those and the different components that make up these different protocols. And then we took a further in-depth look into RIP and actually did some RIP configurations within our network. From there, we started learning more about OSPF. We started by just learning the basics around OSPF and how it's a link state protocol, and it has all these different tables and it communicates these link state advertisements back and forth to communicate what the network looks like, to build a whole SPF tree and have a full map of what the network looks like, and how the configurations of OSPF can actually be quite simple, and we can configure that on our network. But OSPF isn't a simple protocol, and there's a lot of different complexities that we can actually get into when we're configuring OSPF. So then we took a look at OSPF settings. We got further in depth into the OSPF packets and what those different packet types look like and what the functions are of those different packets. We talked about other concepts such as OSPF areas. But with all of that communication back and forth, we can run into issues, especially on a multi-access network. So we started taking a look at OSPF on multi-access networks and how it elects a designated router that carries out the bulk of the communication to all of the routers. So that way you don't have to have all of these routers communicating, and it cuts down on the traffic. Then we took those OSPF skills and applied it to our project. And in the end, we did our configurations and some troubleshooting, so we had connectivity across our whole network. Most networks nowadays use private addressing and have to do some sort of natting or padding. So then we got into NAT and PAT. We talked about the terminology around natting and how Cisco has certain names for the types of addresses there are, and the differences between NAT and PAT and some of the advantages and disadvantages of those. And we got into configuring a lot of different types of scenarios when it comes to NAT and PAT. Then we took those and applied it to our network. And in the end, our whole network was able to communicate to the outside world. But of course, we didn't want our outside world to be able to necessarily get to us. We wanted to block certain traffic and accept certain traffic. So then we got into access control lists. We got into a firewall and what a firewall's job is and how it protects the rest of our network, and how we configure ACLs on a firewall, on a router, or on a layer 3 switch, so we could start controlling the traffic that comes in and out of our networks. And we got into all of the different types of access control lists, from a standard access list to a extended, to a name, to a numbered. We talked about all the differences and where we'd want to implement that, and we actually did some configuration on our devices with that. Of course, then we wanted to see it in action, so we got into our access control list and implemented it within our project. We had that scenario that we created, and then we created an access control list to meet that scenario and the objectives that we were trying to reach. Then we got into tunneling traffic and VPNs, how we can create secure communication across our WAN technologies or across our WAN links. We talked about tunneling, what tunneling is, and the different types of technologies that are tunneling, like the generic routing encapsulation or GRE, and other technologies such as MPLS and IPsec, and how IPsec secures that communication and encrypts that data, and how we can use IPsec and other protocols to implement things like VPN, and how Cisco has an advanced VPN called a DMVPN that really allows us to manage our VPNs for wide enterprise networks much easier. And in the end, we had a fully functioning network that we got to play around with and troubleshoot and be able to come up with different scenarios. So I hope you had a great time going through this content and learned a lot from it. Thanks for joining me with this, and I appreciate you going through the whole course.